Thank you, Senator Rice. Senator Reynolds.
Thank you very much, Mr Acting Deputy President. I too rise to speak on this motion. And in stark contrast to those opposite, we heard a lot of table thumping and, quite frankly, some industrial and economic dinosaurs who, in the opposition, who really want the government and taxpayers to keep indefinitely supporting uncompetitive industries, which instead of creating new national wealth will continue to deplete it. And so in stark contrast, as I said, I rise to say that manufacturing in Australia does have a future, but not as it has been done traditionally in many parts of this country, where the method of manufacture has remained virtually unchanged for over 60 years, if not for over a century. Globalisation and technical advances today are moving so fast, we must as a nation and our economy continue to transform, to compete and to be productive. The automotive industry, quite frankly, is an example of an industry that has failed to transform and adapt to meet contemporary economy and economic circumstances. All states and territories must support, develop and understand their own competitive advantages. Every single state and territory has its own competitive advantages. The big difference is that many states, politicians, business and unions don't work together enough to actually take advantage of those competitive advantages and to implement the change needed to realise them. I am extremely proud to be part of a government that is committed to supporting a strong and competitive Australia-based manufacturing sector, and not a sector based on subsidising inefficient industries of the past, but a government that is supporting innovative businesses and industries of the future to actually generate new national wealth and jobs and provide the resources required for the standard of living that we all want and we all would like to see into the future. We are a party that doesn't just thump the table, as we've just had there, Mr Acting Deputy President, from Senator Carr, but we are a party that doesn't just talk, pontificate and, quite frankly, screech about it endlessly. We are a government that is acting, and we are acting responsibly. Australian manufacturing can be innovative, it can be competitive, and it can be a significant generator of jobs, investments and international exports. But as I said, not just in the way that it is done in several states. However, a competitive manufacturing sector does need a government that creates the incentive for private sector investment and job creation, and an environment that the industries can be productive, innovative and ultimately internationally competitive. But it does also require unions to work with employers and governments to adapt and reform so industries do not die and economies evolve, so that the nation, as I said, has the jobs and revenue to provide the standard of living and the life we all want here in Australia. I'm proud that the Australian government is helping manufacturing by abolishing the carbon tax, cutting the company tax rate by 1.5 percentage points and by cutting around $2 billion in red tape, and not to mention 3 new free trade agreements with some of our biggest trading partners. In this particular area, the Coalition is also implementing the $50 million Manufacturing Transition Program, creating a level playing field for manufacturers by strengthening the anti-dumping regime, implementing a $155 million growth fund and pushing forward with industry innovation and competitiveness agenda, including the industry growth centres. So let's have a look at the facts. We hear a lot of rhetoric and a lot of angry, old-style union verbiage from the last century. But the facts are, under Labor, under the last Labor government, 1 manufacturing job was lost every 19 minutes. 1 job every 19 minutes. And where were those opposite then? Where were the trade unions then? Didn't hear a peep from them. 1 manufacturing job every 19 minutes. And nationally, over the last 14 years, our average growth in manufacturing, the average growth over the last 14 years, every year has sat at 0.4%. That's why we were losing jobs. However, in Western Australia, Mr Acting Deputy President, who I'm sure you're aware of, our average growth in manufacturing has been 4.8% per annum every single year for the last 14 years. Nationally, 0.4% growth in manufacturing jobs. In Western Australia, 4.8%, clearly demonstrating that manufacturing, high-end manufacturing and innovation of the future can be done in Australia, not just how it has been done in states like South Australia and Victoria. So the question in this current debate is why? And that's what I'd like to now share with my colleagues in the Senate, is what can we in Western Australia share with other states who are still struggling to modernise their manufacturing industry. Endless task forces and interventions and subsidies were not the right answer. They were never going to be the right answer, but Labor stubbornly and the union stubbornly refused to accept this. So not only did they order a single ship in 6 years of government, resulting in the current valley of death and the current unemployment for ship workers in South Australia and Victoria, it was one every 19 minutes. So, over the last 14 years, WA manufacturing industry has grown by an average of 4.8% per year. So what does that mean? Total direct employment in West Australia's manufacturing industry increased from 75,000 in the early 1990s to just under 90,000 in 2014-15. 90,000 workers directly involved in competitive and productive manufacturing in our state of Western Australia. In addition to that, in those employed directly, there are still 8,900 employing businesses in manufacturing. I'll say that again in case anyone misheard the numbers. Not only do we have over 90,000 workers directly employed in manufacturing in Western Australia, we have 8,900 employing businesses in manufacturing. And most of those are small manufacturing businesses of high-end bespoke engineering products. So, with that much manufacturing industry, what is the value of manufactured exports in Western Australia alone? So last financial year, WA exported manufactured goods totalling $19.7 billion, which accounted for a full 18% of the total state exports. I find that quite remarkable, given the exponential growth of WA's commodities over the past decade as well. But prior to this growth over the last decade, manufacturing exports from Western Australia accounted for over 20% of the state's total export earnings. So just those figures alone actually demonstrate the fallacy of the arguments of those opposite, that government subsidies, that ongoing government subsidies and other sort of protection measures is needed to be competitive in Australia today. WA has clearly, for the last 14 years and more, demonstrated we can compete in a global market, we can manufacture high-end, complex and bespoke equipment, but just not in the way that has been done in the past. As everybody in this chamber would know, over the past decade there has been a steep change in the size and scale of major resource projects in Western Australia, which has also generated a significant additional capacity in the management and execution of major manufacturing and development projects in what are some of the most technically challenging operating environments in the world. Over the last 10 years, to 2013-14, business investment in Western Australia has totalled $484 billion. And as of this June quarter, the top 3 projects by dollar value alone were the Gorgon LNG project at $61 billion, the Wheatstone LNG project at $29 billion and the Prelude LNG project at $12 billion, largely constructed and built with Australian workers across WA. From the Gorgon to the BHP Billiton and Rio Tinto expansions, Shell's Prelude and Hancock's Roy Hill, there is a significant pool of businesses and individuals who have been involved in multi-billion-dollar green and brownfield projects, which have significant manufacturing and construction elements to them. So these activities include managing suppliers across different jurisdictions and time zones, following strict time schedules, and being intimately involved in the transition to operational phase, again, which has large manufacturing and construction components to them. Despite an often simplistic view of the work we do in Western Australia to mine and export our natural resources, the reality is these operations span logistic chains of hundreds of kilometres and sometimes thousands of kilometres, employing the most technically innovative and sophisticated systems in the world. We also have the manufacturing hubs, the industrial hubs, to support our high-end manufacturing to provide internationally competitive exports. For example, the Australian Marine Complex at Henderson is a world-class centre for excellence for manufacturing, for fabrication, for assembly, for maintenance and technological development, and they service the marine, defence and the resource industries. Since its opening in July 2003, the Australian Marine Complex has delivered 373 major infrastructure and manufacturing projects worth in excess of $1.75 billion and generated more than, directly in Henderson alone, generated more than 26,000 jobs. Today, more than 150 businesses are located within the Australian Marine Complex, which is made up of 4 main precincts: maritime, technology, support industry and fabrication. We, Australian workers, are doing work on internationally competitive work every single day. The common user facility at the Australian Marine Complex also includes a dredge, deep-water harbour, a state-of-the-art fabrication hall with 24-hour all-weather access, a ready-to-use on-site project office, workers' amenities and 40 hectares of lay-down and construction land. It also has 5 wharves, a loadout wharf and marine services wharf, with capacities of 3,000 to 15,000 tonnes respectively. And there's a newly developed marine wharf, a floating dock, and all of the facilities required to build internationally competitive and cost-effective ships. In fact, as of today, more than 250 ships have been built and delivered at the Henderson facilities. And currently, Austal, one of the shipbuilders in location, is not only building 15% of the US naval fleet, they're also building naval vessels for overseas countries at Henderson facilities, and they're doing it on time and on budget and with Australian workers. But again, they're using Australian engineers, metal trade workers, but again, we're doing it in a competitive way and not in the way that has been done and that those opposites still pine for the workforce and the work practices of the past. For Western Australia, manufacturing represents an important opportunity to build on our established primary industries and diversify our economy, just as it does nationally. There are opportunities for local manufacturers to meet the demands of emerging and established markets, particularly under the new free trade agreements, and in emerging economies in our own region. While much has been made of the manufacturing sector being in decline nationally, as I've discussed, this is not the case in Western Australia. Even though manufacturing is not the dominant sector, of the West Australian economy, it is still a solid base and it is still growing strongly and has much greater capacity to grow. Again, not to grow in a subsidised, sort of old-style, table-thumping union style, but in a competitive and productive fashion where the unions, the businesses and the government are working together to make sure that the industries can flourish. So again, I'll just remind people why it is an absolute fallacy that industries here need to be subsidised indefinitely and that they can just rest on their 50, 100 years old, 200-year-old industrial relations and ways of doing business. So I'll just remind you, in Western Australia, manufacturing accounts today for 17% of our export earnings. So not only have we been manufacturing multi-billion-dollar projects in Western Australia for Western Australian oil and gas and mining companies, we have been exporting $21.9 billion every year worth of manufacturing exports. There are 8,900 employing businesses in manufacturing, and 85% of those have an annual turnover of less than $2 million. But those ones who survive and thrive are innovative, they are productive to make themselves internationally competitive. The industry in Western Australia provides 91,000 specialist jobs, making manufacturing the state's 7th largest employer. which is pretty amazing given all the other pressures on the workforce in Western Australia. In fact, manufacturing contributes 4.9% of gross value to the Western Australian economy. But why is manufacturing so different in Western Australia than the rest of the country? Why are we increasing nearly 5% per annum over the last 14 years, when nationally it's been less than 0.5%? To find the answer to that, you really have to go back to the history of Western Australia itself. Western Australia has always been a trade-exposed economy, and right back to Federation never relied on the subsidies that eastern seaboard colonies received post-Federation for their already protected manufacturing industries. In Western Australia, instead, we developed into industries geared towards primary industries and exports. And from 1829, our economies focused on wool through to sandalwood, whaling, fishing, timber, pearling and gold, and more recently nickel, iron ore, alumina and natural gas. But they are all commodities that relied on sale on the open market internationally and not our domestic market, which was so much of the economies of the eastern seaboard colonies. West Australian manufacturing, as we recognise it today, began to develop and expand during World War II. After the end of the war, growth opportunities were limited, and states such as Victoria and South Australia grew a heavy industry base servicing the domestic Australian market. Manufacturing represented a substantial component of our national economy, and by the late 1950s it accounted for 29% of Australian GDP. But this national industry policy affected WA manufacturing very differently. Due to the size of the nationwide manufacturing centres, national industry policy ended up focusing on areas where plants and employees were concentrated. This pattern of industry never arose in Western Australia. As I said, WA has always been trade and export focused. While a large-scale manufacturing industry was not created in WA as it was in the eastern states, which are now in the process of adjusting and downsizing and are subject to much hand-wringing and eternal angst from those opposite with very few solutions on how to change it, the WA manufacturing industry emerged in the 1950s and 60s as the agricultural and resources sector rapidly expanded. It was at that time the resource development was prioritised and the important industrial hubs such as Kwinana emerged. These allowed for WA manufacturers to capitalise on support services concentrated within these hubs, also then allowing them to draw on the expertise and business in these local industrial hubs, and by focusing on the requirement of WA primary industries, encouraged other manufacturers to become more flexible and efficient in meeting the needs of niche industrial products, which is a trend that has continued today. Again, not subsidised, but innovating to meet not only the domestic requirements in Western Australia, but the international market. Despite the primary sector experiencing boom and busts during the second half of the 20th century, by the mid-20th century a small but focused manufacturing sector had successfully adapted to major economic challenges while accommodating WA's needs. While WA's economy has flourished in recent years on the back of the expanses of the resource sector, it has provided a range of benefits for the community, including a world-class, internationally competitive, export-orientated manufacturing sector. While it is ultimately the private sector that will determine manufacturing in Australia, the government today must create the best environment to foster success. But they can't do it alone. It does require the support of business and also the unions to make sure that we are able to make the changes and transform and to make the hard decisions, which some states clearly have not been able to do today. So, in summary, it is for these reasons and the example from Western Australia, Mr Acting Deputy President, that I do support this current program, the ATS. But like any programs, it is a transition program, and it is not a program that is there to be a hammock forever. And it must finish, and it must finish so that the industries that it is helping to transition are able to stand on their own 2 feet. The manufacturing sector, as I said at the beginning, does have a very viable and a very bright future in Australia, and it can provide for the long term for the skilled jobs and the revenue for the Australian economy. West Australia is living proof that it can. But complaining and continually seeking subsidies
Senator
and refusing
Reynolds,
to take the
your
decisions
time has expired.
will not deliver
Senator
reform.